well. And Ahmad, of course, thanks so much for participating in this. I do think that communication, and when we say the word debate, what that implies is communication. And so I think that's great. That's essential to science. And I hope that this is a good opportunity for people to lay out different technical positions, and that facilitates kind of understanding everybody else's perspective better. If nothing else, that's the best goal here. So thanks a lot, Ahmad, for participating. And I want to talk briefly about my background. In my company, we sell software licenses and we do a lot of consulting work for clients. The last 7 years, we've done over 100. And that's kind of the perspective that I am bringing to this, is I spend a lot of time with field data all the time. And when we do a project and we have to calibrate a model, we start by building something that looks like this. It's a table of key observations. So we'll have data from all sorts of different sources, from fiber, microseismic, obviously production data, geochemical data, on and on and on. And we'll make a table like this, and then we will systematically construct a model to match all available data. And so that's kind of my perspective, is what have I found to be successful consistently at explaining all the available data that we actually have in a field scale, shale data set. So let me close that. Yeah, so my position here, at the beginning of the shale revolution 20 plus years ago, certain hypotheses were developed about what the fracture geometry looks like in the far field when we're doing hydraulic fracturing in unconventionals. Roughly 10 years ago, I think there was a major shift in the industry, and that shift occurred because of access to different types of data and better data. And I'll talk through that. But above all, I think my number one message is I think it's important to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. And I've seen this many times in my career on a variety of topics, that early interpretations become kind of the dogma. And then when new information comes in, I think we as a community sometimes struggle to shift it. And so my number one message is we need to view our assumptions as hypotheses to be tested by data. All right, so to define terms, here are some examples of complex fracture network models. The overall modeling approach is to create a discrete fracture network that represents natural fractures in the formation, and then simulate fracture propagation through that. A kind of differentiating characterization of these complex shale models has been the idea that hydraulic fractures terminate when they reach the natural fractures. They may not always, but often they do. And that creates this kind of zigzagging flow pathways through the fractures, like we see here in this paper by Jiawei Wing and Olga Cressy and others. Schlumberger was a very influential paper back in 2011. Here's a paper that I wrote, and I'm including this image to show that I spent the beginning of my career doing DFN, complex fracture network modeling, for shale and EGS. And I moved away from that because I, number one, felt that those models did not always have good explanatory power, and I saw discrepancies. And number two, because I became exposed to new data that has come out. So a planar fracture network model, continuous flow pathways occur through continuous planar features. May or may not have curving, but that's not the topic of the discussion today. The topic of the discussion today is really about the use of a DFN creating these kinds of zigzagging pathways. Now, certainly, the use of a planar fracture model does not preclude the idea that there are natural fractures in the formation. And actually, sometimes we will put in a discrete fracture. We might do that if we know that there is a fault or some major fracture zone that's clearly deviating fluid. We would deterministically put that in, and I do see that from time to time. But I think the question is, what is kind of the baseline behavior when we do hydraulic fracturing? And also, I want to emphasize that small scale complexity is very real. And I'll show some pictures of that from core. I think it's pretty unambiguous. We use constitutive relations to account for the effect of small scale complexity. So I think that what I'm representing here as a planar fracture, I think that's really multiple fractures. And I think that affects things like leak off, production, propagation, and proppant placement. And I think that natural fractures affect things like the bulk formation properties. But I think the question is, do we need to include this kind of branching behavior? And not only do we need to, is it actually correct to do so? So my position is that the large majority of the time, hydraulic fractures in shale are predominantly planar when you zoom out and look at them at field scale, although apparently they seem to be forming swarms of subparallel hydraulic fractures. I don't think we fully understand why or how, but that is a consistent observation. I think they are complex at small scale, and we do need to adjust things to account for that. And I won't have time to really go into that. So my view is that in shale, the complex branching fracture network is not representative of what the flow pathways look like. It's not that I think it's impractical. I think it is not actually, the representation of reality. And as I said, no, that's not to say that natural fractures don't have an important role. So here's some pictures from fiber. This is from the HFTS2 project. And what I want to emphasize up here is the microseismic half lengths from this part of this well. There's fiber in this well, and there's fiber in this well. There are abundant frac hits occurring in this well and this well, even though the microseismic shows that there aren't. And I have seen that many times. I like to joke that in around 2018, 2019, when fiber came out, suddenly the fractures got a lot longer when I would engage with field data. And it's because often microseismic is incorrect, just flat out wrong on the fracture length. And we know that because we see frac hits in fiber all the time. I don't know why. I'm not a microseismic expert, but I tell you as the consumer of the data, that is what I've experienced many times. Also, there is a lot of uncertainty on the breadth of the microseismic cloud. And because of that, even if you had a planar fracture, you can routinely see a very broad region of microseismicity. And that's because it is just a very non-unique and challenging and uncertain thing to generate microseismic hypocenters. So the existence of a broad cloud of microseismicity is actually consistent with basically any conceptual model, even though it is often used as evidence for a DFN model. Also, we often look at data from things like this famous Mineback study in the 80s. That's very shallow rock. It's volcanic tuff. It's really not a clean analogy for shale. And while laboratory experiments are very valuable, they are also much tinier than a field scale data set. Also, I think that there is small scale complexity, and I think the laboratory experiments capturing that, but that doesn't necessarily scale up, and we can't literally take them like a one-to-one representation of things that are happening 1,000 times bigger. So to me, the highest quality data is direct at the wellbore field scale observation. So here's an example of one of the early and influential core through studies that was performed in the Eagleford, ConocoPhillips. What they saw was swarms of subparallel hydraulic fractures. And this is surprising. We didn't expect to see a lot of closely spaced hydraulic fractures, but that's what they saw in this core. We don't see fractures zigzagging around in a lot of different, kind of crazy directions. We don't see any sort of SRV around these fractures at all. What we see is swarms of subparallel fractures. And I don't think there's anything better than this kind of data. We can put our hands on it and we know what the fractures look like. If we look at their orientations, they're fairly consistent. It turns out that's not a new observation. I remember reading this paper in grad school. In '93, they did a core through study, and they saw a swarm of subparallel hydraulic fractures. And there's a nice little argument between Warpinski and Nolte about what that means. At the time, I think people thought maybe this was a one-off, but now this keeps happening, and we just see it every time, and apparently this is the norm. And from the theory perspective, I think we should all be having a field day with that. But from the empirical perspective, it's clearly not, zigzagging around and deviating off 50 feet along a natural fracture and then cutting back. We just don't see that. It's just not there. Now, I want to emphasize the existence of small scale complexity. Here's some papers or some images from HFTS1. This is Julia Gale's paper. This looks like a bifurcating fracture. There is a busted up place here. So we need to account for that. And as I said, we account for that with constitutive relations affecting a variety of things. But what we're looking at here, that's 1 inch scale complexity. That's not, a DFN causing a fracture to rip off 50 feet to the east and then cut back again north. So some problems here. The common approach is to run an image log and then generate a DFN, but the fractures may not reactivate because they may be mineralized shut. They also might be quite small, right? If you look at fractures in shale, often they're small little features, and they're terminating in the core, which shows that they're not very big. So even if they did reactivate, they may not shear stimulate. Even if they do reactivate, they may not form a percolating and kind of well-connected network that goes very far away. And if they're not very big, this big, field scale hydraulic fracture can just go over and under it. So that was what I found when I started trying to do modeling with these DFN approaches. You kind of have to jigger the model assumptions just right to kind of make it work. So I think the DFN approach is applicable in many settings, but I think it's often not in shale. I think it's usually not in shale. And though really, again, what I want to emphasize is it's a hypothesis that needs to be justified from empirical data. And I think far too often we assume it a priori as a modeling assumption, and then we kind of go with that. And I think that's not the right approach. Also need to emphasize fiber optics. So there are many, many papers written in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years showing that if you fracture a particular region of the subsurface, like a stage along a well, you can draw a straight line in the direction of SH max, and you will see frac hits in a roughly similar width region. We call that a frac corridor. That's what Gustavo Ugueto is showing here. Here are more examples. Now, I will emphasize, having seen a ton of data, that this is not always the case. I have seen data sets where we see off-azimuth frac hits, and I do think in those cases, it's plausible to think that there could be fluid deviating along faults and then cutting up. So I don't want to make 100% generalizations about things, but most of the time, the large majority of the time, 90% plus, it looks basically like what Gustavo is showing here. And also, if we look at the strain signature of the frac hits, they look exactly like propagating hydraulic fractures. They're very concordant with what numerical models predict they should look like, which I think is a huge win for the theory of fracture mechanics. Here are some quotes from papers. These are I'm just reviewing the literature here. Siazabka from HFTS2, he said, fracs are not random. They do not have a complex branching architecture. They are forming frac domains that are mostly planar and parallel. So really what I'm communicating here is just what all the people who are looking at core through, and you know, Julia Gale's on the call, you can correct me if you feel otherwise. But while there's small scale complexity, it's basically orienting in these planar corridors. Here's some other papers. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I think I'm out of time, is the industry trend. So 10, 15 years ago, people are using open hole completions. They're using very broad cluster spacings, like 100, 200-foot cluster spacing, with the idea that you don't need to put perf clusters close together because the fractures are just going to naturally branch out and make a broad, kind of laterally wide region of stimulation. In 2024, nobody's doing that anymore. Everybody, pretty much ubiquitously in the oil and gas industry, is using very tight cluster spacing, like 15, 20, 25, 30, maybe 40-foot cluster spacing with limited entry. And it's because of the realization that you have to force the fractures to form at a tight spacing. Maybe occasionally they spread out into a broad fairway. They usually don't, and you can't count on it. When we go back to old Bakken shale well projects, so we'll model a parent well from 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and then we'll come in and we'll model a child well nearby with a modern completion. We'll put one planar fracture per stage in those old school open hole completions. We have no problem whatsoever history matching to that data, and then we can come in with the modern completion at 25-foot cluster spacing. We have no problem matching that data either. So really, it's not just academic, but it's affected frac design, and what the frac design, the actual production results, and the billions of dollars that get spent have clearly moved away from designs that rely upon a broad fairway of stimulation. And we see the same thing in EGS. If you look at Fervo, what they've done in the last year, they are making frac designs that do not rely on complexity. They're taking just closely spaced prop to fractures, just like they do in oil and gas, and that has dramatically improved performance. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Mark. Ahmad, then it's your turn, so please share.
So can you see my screen?
Yes, it comes up
Great.
nicely. Thank you. If you want to put it in presentation mode.
No, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. Not at all. Yeah.
Keep track of what's coming next.
Please go ahead.
So yes, thank you again. Thanks to the committee for organizing this discussion and debate. And you know, it's a great opportunity to explore some of the issues that are of concern to all of us. So my position really is that the hydraulic fracturing in reality is frequently more complex, and not that we cannot use planar features to forecast production and do history match, but that is just one representation of perhaps a more complicated geometry that you know happens to match the production trends. So, but of course, this issue is not new, as you pointed out, Alexei, and Mark also emphasized. It has a long history, at least 35 years. And it goes back to the data that was presented by Warpinski and colleagues, showing multiple hydraulic fractures in a chord interval. And of course, Nolte took issue with that observation and classified it as the worst case. And his suggestion was that this is just a particular geologic setting, a particular sand with specific stress and permeability structure that leads to this kind of a configuration. And this is perhaps unique and could be the worst case that can be ignored. And so, so I'm going to continue to see if, in fact, that is a worst case or a one-off, or there are other cases where the trend tends to repeat itself. And for the purpose of this presentation, I want to clarify that to me, non-planar is meant to represent not a single plane. That is, I include swarms and clusters in the non-planar concept, essentially. So just a brief overview of the other worst cases that have been observed in the field is useful for discussion. So Lehman and Brumley, they did lab experiments and clearly illustrated near wellbore fractures, multiple of them, and also far field. And they did extensive numerical modeling to match the pressure history that was observed in the field cases. And Schlafferberski, everybody is familiar with him, he and his colleagues also acknowledged the fact that there could be multiple fractures, and they associated that with the process zone concept. Hopkins relied on coring of hydraulic fracturing test results in Antrim shale, and he actually observed 8 different hydraulic fractures in 2 wells. And his conclusions based on the core and microseismic data, and again, this is important because he didn't rely on just microseismicity, he actually extracted core as well. And they concluded that the SRV was rather complex, and a single planar fracture was not the case. And all of these findings and observations were actually summarized in a nice paper by Marder in 1996. And then 1998. And he showed his own data and also underscored Wright's observation that if you take surface tilt meter data from different areas, oil and gas, geothermal, coal bed, that the hydraulic fracturing treatments tend to be non-planar, and in fact, it could be multiple far field fractures. And so that was, again, supported by tilt-meter data. And all of this, this debate led to additional work by Germanovich and his colleagues in 1997. And they considered, in fact, the vertical segmentation of hydraulic fractures. And that's an important aspect that seems to be neglected. That is, we have lateral swarms, but then these swarms could be segmented vertically upward. And that impacts net pressure, among other things. And so we also did a workflow to actually consider the number of segments in design of hydraulic fractures. Other non-planar cases are very common. The Cotton Valley gas field, Rutledge and Phillips studied that extensively. And I have not seen any retraction of their microseismic analysis that was used to decipher the outcome of the stimulation, and they concluded that there were the SRV was dominated by natural fracture system that was subparallel to SH Max. Same thing in the Barnett Shale. Maxwell and his colleagues again underscored the complexity relying on microseismic data. In addition, we have the study by Kwong and Zobak that clearly illustrates the role of natural fractures. They call them faults. But clearly, there's a DFN that is reactivated, possibly by a planar hydraulic fracture that intersects them and maybe jogs and zigzags, possibly. But nevertheless, the SRV that results from that stimulation is more complex than a single hydraulic fracture plane. And they also underscored the contribution of aseismic slip to permeability creation. And of course, Mark underscored the study of Ratterman and ConocoPhillips. I gave a talk, a rope talk in 2022, I believe. And so I was kind of doubting that these fractures are actually hydraulic. and posed a number of scenarios for their formation. But nevertheless, there seems to be a lot of natural fractures that contribute to the SRV based on this study. But on the other hand, are quite a number of hydraulic fractures that have been created in the process as well, suggesting the swarm concept. Same thing in the Wolfcamp. HFTS1 and HFTS2 both indicate numerous fractures. There are 700 fractures, two sets of natural fractures. Some are calcite filled, some are not. So some are more prone to reactivation than others. But the conclusion at least is that there is 100 hydraulic fractures that form. Now, the data of HFTS2 has been published, and a comprehensive report that goes along with it that has different interpretations of the outcome. So I reviewed that report, and Bessa and et al., they clearly underscore complexity of the network that has been created, relying on the fact that there are two sets of natural fractures, one conducive to reactivation and one set not. And this seems to be consistent with the conceptual model that Dussault and McLennan and Dussault had proposed in the earlier days, again, along the lines of Warpinski's thinking. So, and they correctly underscored the fact that structural context, geomechanical properties, lithology, and in situ stress will dominate the outcome. But Agueto and others who also contributed to that report tended to emphasize the swarm concept. And they more or less rejected the idea of SRV formation as a result of natural fracture reactivation. However, they based that on the fact that 500 of more than 1,200 fractures were classified as hydraulic, and discounted, in my view, the contribution of the remaining 700 fractures that were observed, and attributed those perhaps to core handling and other things. At the same time, they underscored the fact that microseismicity cannot be relied upon because aseismic fracturing can contribute to formation of fractures. Well, if that is the case, then in fact, we could have natural fractures being reactivated aseismically. So the fact that microseismic does not record them doesn't preclude the fact that they can exist. So, but anyway, their emphasis is some parallel swarms with some dominant hydraulic fractures with more than expected height growth. And so again, that's one way of looking at the data, and they used the fiber signature to support their analysis. So my summary, more or less encapsulating my position, is that the complexity of the stimulation outcome cannot be denied. There are multiple worst-case scenarios that have been actually observed by different groups at different times. And the complexity, as we have known, is ultimately determined by the interaction of the in-situ stress and the rock fabric. And even if we accept the swarm concept, which we have worked on and we have simulated, the incorporation of it in both hydraulic fracture modeling and reservoir modeling still not a settled issue. So engineering solutions may simplify to perhaps a single planar fracture for reservoir modeling with some enhanced permeability surrounding it. But that is mostly a tool's limitation rather than a confirmation that reality is actually simple. More importantly, in my position, is the fact that the seemingly subparallel planar fractures in the Wolfcamp are forming a basis for extending this concept to other areas, which is of high risk in my view, particularly to geothermal. In fact, the recent geothermal experience, in my mind, particularly Fairwell's experience, suggests that designing based on single hydraulic fracture conceptual model is erroneous. And the outcome is, in fact, more complex than we like to think. And I thank you for your attention, and we'll be happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Ahmad. Well, actually, thank you both for explaining your case, presenting your case in a timely manner. So we have at least half an hour our scheduled time for Q&A, and as discussed, as explained at the beginning, so we'll start with giving you opportunity to ask a couple of questions each other. So Mark started last time, so maybe Ahmad, you have a choice of asking your first question to Mark based on his presented position. Please go ahead.
Well, my question is that it appears that Mark more or less has modified a little bit his position from a strictly planar fracture model to allowing for a more, I don't want to say complex, but less than ideal stimulation outcome. And if that is the case, that's nice. But is that based on some recent findings that he has come across, or is that just a kind of assessment of the future potential stimulations?
Yeah, thanks, Ahmad. And I think it's great. And the goal of this is to facilitate communication. So, I've been teaching ResFrac training courses for about 5 years, and the phrase planar at field scale, complex at small scale is the phrase that I have always used in all of our training courses. And so to cover some of the topics that we think about, absolutely they're multi-stranded, and I think we're in complete agreement on that. It affects leak off, and we definitely have to use a higher effective permeability for leak off than we do for production, no question. Otherwise, you will not capture key aspects of the data. And that could arise naturally from having a multi-stranded propagation. We see somewhat elevated effective fracture toughness in most projects, not always. Sometimes we really do just get like a 3,000 foot long planar fracture, and that's what the data shows. But it affects toughness. I think it affects proppant transport, and we have ways of trying to capture that. So again, the concept that I use is, you can do a grain scale simulation of multi-phase flow, but you can't do that at a field scale model. So we use relative permeability curves. And similarly, we affect leak off, toughness, viscous pressure drop, and proppant placement to account for the fact that it's multi-stranded. So I think we agree on that. But my point I think that I would make is, when people say complex DFN fracture network, they're really usually not simulating a multi-stranded hydraulic fracture propagation. And I think that's a great thing to simulate. I think that's something we, on the research side would be really cool to investigate a lot more. But that's my conceptual model is, I think if there's, to the extent that natural fractures create complexity, I think it might jog over 1 foot and then propagate away. I just don't see it in most projects, going 100 feet that way, and then, that's the difference.
Okay. Mark, your chance to ask question.
No, actually, I already said the thing I wanted to say, so I'm good.
Well, do you have any follow-up question before I open up?
No, I don't have any questions. I think it's good to let the audience pose their points of view on questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And I'll note that we should talk about geothermal since Ahmad raised it, but we can wait till you want to do that.
I would wait because
okay, we'll wait. Okay.
And we already have a bit of mixed data coming in, so some older results at different scales, field scale, mine banks, and experimental. So if you bring geothermal, we're just adding to complexity of apple, oranges, and other fruits that we are trying to compare. But it's a great application that if we have time, we should discuss at the end. Then first question, Craig, you raise your hand first. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, great. I'll even turn on my camera so you see it's a real person here. So appreciate the historical perspective. That was great. As you can see, we've been on this journey for 30 plus years, and I went through the cycle myself of planar to complex to planar, and I think the real question is that how do we get to a point where our models capture enough of the complexity that we probably all agree is there, and to where the models are now predictive? And I think we're making a lot of progress, but I'm going to pose that to both of the speakers: are we close, or are we really far away from capturing this complexity with I'll call it the knobs that approximate the physics that we just really can't include it?
So, you want me to go first? Yeah, I think there are pathways to enable us to capture this complexity. And again, I agree with Mark that the complexity at a very small scale may be relevant. we're not attempting to capture that kind of a detail, get into the weeds, but the larger scale complexity, I think it can be captured. Unfortunately, though, it appears that there's not a whole lot of perhaps incentive at this stage to invest in that kind of development. And I think not just myself, but other groups are spending efforts to enhance their models to allow for capturing this complexity. But then again, there's always the computational costs associated with it. And so one has to consider the utility in practice. But to me, it appears that we may get away with the simplifications in certain cases, for sure, maybe in the wolf camp. But in the next field basin or in the next energy sector, the situation may be such that we will have to resort to these more kind of computationally expensive simulations.
Yeah, and I think, let's see. Yeah, I think the data over the last decade has gotten spectacular. And Craig, you have been as good as anybody on the planet at collecting exceptional data sets that constrain the model so well. With far field fiber, we know how many frac hits occur, when, and where. That's incredibly detailed information that we did not have 10 years ago. We can do geochemical analysis, and we can run microseismic. We see how high up the fractures go. So we know their lengths, we know their heights, we know literally how many they are and how consistent they are in the far field. These pressure observation laterals that you have done, Craig and Exxon has done, the slant wells, we know what the pressure is at 100 feet and 200 feet, 300 feet, 400 feet during production, and we can see where the propped length falls off. We can run downhole imaging in the well, and we can see where the erosion's happening. So we can see how uniformly the fluid is exiting the well. So when you kind of put together all of the package of modern diagnostics, you really actually are dialing in all of the things that we need to know. Now, if you zoom in enough, there's places where we don't know things. But I think the availability of data has gotten so good that that gives us a lot better confidence and ability to constrain the models.
Can I make quick comments, abusing my power, and then I'll pass it to Tiendo. Quick comment is methodology, which is, we're talking about complexity. There is complexity, then how do we account for it, and whether we have sufficient tools. But in engineering practice, at least that's how I was taught back in the Soviet Union system, that you need to answer engineering question, and then you are trying to say, what is the simplest possible model that would allow you to achieve that goal, to answer that question. So I think that's the essence of Nolte's response to Warpinski's paper. Wasn't so much that you're in complex geological systems, so it's not applicable anywhere else. I thought that his main message was that, all right, we observe complexity here, but for our engineering applications, in that case, meaning designing hydraulic fractures which are economic efficient and achieves the desired specifications, it does matter. So, and I think that was his main question, that at that scale, it's all very interesting, but it's not relevant for this specific engineering problem. So when we talk about complexities, for me, the question would be, for what application? If you think that we care where proppant is, whether we're wasting proppant, that's one application. If we care about well interference, parent-child, that's another application. And that puts us on a more well-defined playing field. What scale is important for what processes, and what level of complexity is relevant to those applications. But that's just a comment. Yeah.
Well, that's correct, and I agree. But so for sure, prop and transport would be impacted. I mean, even HFTS results do show that not all these fractures take proppant. So that needs to be justified. And again, considering the fact that this is just core from one small location in the reservoir, and there are other stimulations that have taken place, all of that. So prop and transport contribution to production, fluid pathways, if it's gas production. All of these obviously are important and need to be considered. And that then hinges on how do you handle the existence of these multiple fractures in your simulations. Of course, you can turn knobs, and try to accommodate them somehow to match X, Y, and Z. But does that capture the actual physics and the actual process that is taking place that can be extrapolated to somewhere else? And I tend to disagree with Alexei on the Nolte's, and I respect Nolte a lot, and he's a great engineer and scientist. But he did wish that we could ignore all Warpinski's data because it was just a one-off, right? And of course, when you read his paper, then he does say that, well, maybe a single planar model would still be an engineering, a solid engineering approach for practitioners. But at the end of the day, I got the message, at least from reading his paper, that he thought that was just one particular situation that we would not see often.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And I'll comment, Alexei. Yeah. I think that there's places for different kinds of models, right? So in my day-to-day life, I am trying to match field scale data sets and match all the observations and then make engineering recommendations. Certainly there's other, more applications. Hey, we want to be really detailed and dial in everything perfectly exactly the way it is. But my point would be if I was sitting in academia and I was trying to make really super realistic detailed models that might not be practical at field scale and engineering application, but I wanted to do that, as a research tool, I'd be really focused on the phenomenons creating this multi-stranded swarm thing. And I think we have a lot of uncertainty about why that's happening. And again, I don't think that's a complex branching discrete fracture network. I think that, like what we saw in the EGS Colab project, a hydraulic fracture propagated, it hit a large fracture zone. It terminated, it moved over 6 inches, and then it kept going. And that's a little different than what we see in a lot of these DFN models where it would terminate and then go 60 feet and then turn left, right? If you zoomed out, it still looked pretty planar, even though the fact that it terminated and then reinitiated 6 inches away does matter, right? That does affect a lot of things, but it's a different way of representing it.
Mark, what I would take from the collab though is the fact that we got a fracture network at the end of the day, and so the hydraulics changed completely because of the fact that there were natural fractures that were intersected, regardless of if there was a planar hydraulic fracture that initiated or not. The outcome was a complex fracture network.
So that's your opinion, Ahmad, but the body of researchers who worked on that project with Ping-Ching Fu's paper had an opposite conclusion. So
yeah,
I'll just say that.
The data does not, the data set does not support a single planar model. We had a paper published separately on that.
Yeah.
And we showed that, in fact, the sprays or the fluid emission points in the observation well could be very easily explained by the seepage through the mineralized fractures. And we simulated that in the lab, and in fact showed that you can get the same spraying of the fluids out of the field fractures. And
Mark, Ahmed, let me intervene for a second. So we have 5 people waiting to ask questions. So lovely discussion. So let's get to Tiando. So please go ahead.
Hey,
and name who you ask questions to, because it's both panelists or anyone specific. Go ahead.
All right, sounds good. Good morning, everyone. Great debate, and thanks, Mark, and thanks, Ahmed. Great observation, great conclusion and summaries. So I think I'm going to share my observation on very recent projects and would like to get your thought on it, actually. So it's a fiber optic project, and we have 2 wells. Basically, the treatment well is 1,000 feet from observation wells, and they are 2 parent wells, so no parent child. The design was 120 feet apart. So at the observation well, what we saw is actually the 2 frac hits. It could widely range from 250 to 400 feet. So that is signature of complexity. Now, I do not know it's going to be, really the magnitude of complexities is still planar at that point. But what we saw here is basically you from 6 cluster at spacing 125 feet total. But by the time it reached 1,000 feet out, we observed the hit 400 feet apart. What can you explain that? And later on, we correlate with some other data, from drilling data as well. So the wider frac corridors, it correlate with higher signature of the microseismics from the observation well. So it means that basically the natural fractures have large effect on how your fracture will propagate the far field. So that is basically is a fascinating observation for me. So a question for Mark would be, when you build a model to simulate this situation, like, do you have all the data that you can combine and make that, how to say, to model that picture that we observe from the fiber optic data?
So to regurgitate what you said, I think you said there was something like a single frac stage, maybe something like 100 and something feet wide, with 6 or 8 clusters, and you saw 2 frac hits in the far field fiber, and they were 400 feet apart, right?
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, I think the first question I would ask is that something that's reproducible all the way down the lateral? Because you're right, you see that, and again, I'm not arguing that never happens. For sure. Question is, if you do 50 stages and that happened 3 or 4 times, that's one thing. If you do 50 stages that happen like 80% of the time, that's a totally different story in my view.
60%. 60% of instant, 60% of the entire lateral, and it's not always 400 feet, but it's larger than what the stage spacing for.
Yeah, and I assume you're accounting for the azimuth of the fractures and everything. Yeah, so I mean, and you do need to account for that because it'll rotate down. But anyway, yeah, I mean, so maybe there was some spreading. Another alternative possibility is you could be having flow outside casing, and you could be actually kicking off fractures just from further down the injection well. But yeah, I mean, certainly there are cases like that, and it's possible. Right.
Yeah, no, I don't have any comment on that because I think more information would be needed to actually be able to make a meaningful assessment for me. But I would just point out that the fact that there are these complexities also point to an opportunity that you can design then your injection practices to minimize or maximize depending on what your needs are really. But appreciating the fact that things do happen in a complex fashion then points to the question as to why. And then if we figure that out, we can manipulate the process and come up with better engineering solutions.
Thank you. Then Jason, you're next. Please ask your question. Thank you, Chandu.
Yep. I'll turn on my video here. Hold on. Am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Hey, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Echo those comments. Thanks for the format and thanks for the discussion today. It's pretty awesome. I want to follow up on a comment that Julia made in the chat. With the philosophy of, is this one size fits all, depending on, certainly could depend on the play or the reservoir you're talking about, or even part of the basin, depending on the geomechanical conditions. So I'd like to hear the panel's feedback on how these observations or how this modeling going forward would be applied to different possible end members. So we talked about the Eagle Ford, obviously maybe the behavior is different in the Permian versus the Williston versus the Marcellus or what have you.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the viewpoint that one should consider. That is, one conceptual model may not fit all. In fact, would not, and so one can take from the experiences from one play to another, but at the same time you have to look at the particulars of the formation. I do have multiple. Now, Mark mentioned several sources of data, and he has access certainly to a lot more data than I do. But the few that I have seen actually do underscore some of these complexities and the change in SHMAX, the change in hydraulic fracture direction at different intervals, which could be explained by changes in stress direction. But apparently the natural fractures are more controlling there, and that's say Niobrara or some other formation that I've come across. So the stress heterogeneity plus the rock fabric, of course, those have to be considered in each particular situation. And I think those they have consequences on design. It would seem to me you can't just use the exact same workflow for all of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think to me, the role of the natural fractures is more than anything determined by the properties of the natural fractures. And, you know, in a DFN, everything's a plane, but in reality, there's a big difference between a little calcite filled joint that's 4 feet long in radius and, you know, and a kilometer scale fault. And I think sometimes that gets lost when you just kind of make a stereo net. And to me, that's the biggest differentiator. Certainly, like in our geothermal work, for example, what I've said with Roland in our papers is the number one determinant of whether or not fluid is going to divert into natural fractures is whether or not you have big, well-developed permeable faults or whether you just have little crack-like features. And they're really two different things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Colin, it's your turn, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so in general, I think the idea of a single planar hydraulic fracture is a bit naive, and I know that the debaters have to take extreme positions, but I think any discussion has to include some sort of characterization of the natural fracture network and the stress anisotropy as well. Things will be a strong function of stress anisotropy. And given enough time and money, which we don't usually have, modeling should answer these questions. Now, to some extent, Mark is capturing this because he mentioned that he uses a constitutive relation to include the effect of multi-stranded hydraulic fractures, and that's a good direction. Of course, the upscaling problem is a continuing problem. So it would be interesting to see what kind of constitutive relation is used. I mean, is it just some function with a whole bunch of parameters? How could those parameters be interpreted into, so on the industrial scale, I completely agree with Mark. That's the way to go. But that constitutive relationship is capturing the effect of natural fractures or multi-strands, etc. And the other comment I would make is, Mark said that you can get a very good history match, and there's no doubt about that. But I remember being invited to an SPE conference. I mean, I'm a geophysicist, so I was surprised by being asked, but I went to this thing in San Diego, and people were indeed saying that they could history match with a single planar fracture. So I asked the question, well, okay, you history match, but how good are your predictions of future production? And the response of the community there was that the future predictions are terrible. So, I'd like to ask Mark whether, in his experience, the predictions of future production hold up.
Yeah, well, we have a fun paper at URTEC this year where 4 years ago, we did a refract simulation study with Chesapeake, and they came back 3-4 years later, and they plotted up what we said would happen and what happened, and they're right on top of each other. So that's one example. But I think the problem of non-uniqueness is very important. Several years ago, Craig Sapola and Garrett and I wrote a paper with this Utica data set. We used 2 different permeability values. One model had a 50x higher permeability than the other, and we history matched the data in both by basically just arbitrarily changing the fracture length. We took the models out to 30 years, and they had the same production at 30 years. You might say, well, then it's totally useless. But then we did an optimization of well spacing and cluster spacing, and we got totally different answers. So the conclusion was you could have the wrong permeability, you could match the data, and then get the wrong answer and make the wrong frac design and well design. And so the solution to that is to bring in multiple overlapping pieces of data. So we can use defits to estimate permeability. We can use interference tests to estimate the frac prop length, and we can use different types of data. So if we use a lot of different kinds of data, that we can try to constrain that uncertainty. And I think that's the key.
So Mark, could you comment on the type of constitutive relation?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give 2 examples. One that I love is Jorge Acuna has done this fractional dimension RTA work. The idea is explicitly that so in RTA, if you have like a 50-foot fracture spacing, they won't interfere, and then suddenly they'll interfere. What he's doing is he's saying every one of those quote fractures at 50 feet is really a swarm. And so there's a multiple fractures that interfere at different points in time. And so the effective fracture surface area for leak off and production becomes a function of distance, which is kind of cool. And so when you put that in, you actually match the rate transient analysis curves better. That kind of loss of productivity that you see, and it's kind of a gradual onset. And it also actually accelerates leak off. So I find that exceptionally useful for the model. We do need to increase leak off at early time during fracturing, during shut-in, and also it captures the long-term production trends. So we've actually taken Acuna's fractional dimensional stuff, we've put it into the model, and that's part of our workflow now. So that would be one example.
Okay, thank you. Ahmad, do you have any comments?
Well, the way I look at the constitutive equation, it describes the rock behavior that is, you apply so much pressure to or so much stress, and you get this much strain, or you get so many fractures. And I don't think this is really a constitutive model. It's more of a fitting parameter, it would seem to me. So. But I think there are opportunities to develop constitutive models that would help us to enable multiple fracture propagation without having to rely on having the DFN present necessarily.
And Alexi, I'd love to do the geothermal question if you want to spend 5 minutes on that.
Yeah.
Well, I need to give chance people to ask questions.
The geothermal is a very important component, and I think we don't have time probably to cover all aspects of it. But I'd be happy to stick around and have a discussion on that.
If you can stay a little bit longer after the hour, then we can get there. We have 3 more people, but I do want just a very, very quick follow up on Colin's question. So we talk about complexity, but then it looks like we start to mix stranded this observed tensile accompanying questions on this parallel fracture system with nature fractures, and I don't think it's appropriate to mix them up, because those strands they were interpreted as induced, they were not there. And for practitioners and companies and spending money, as Colin said, that to characterize fractures, it's something different. It's spending a lot of effort characterizing what's in situ before you do anything. So those stranded fractures that Mark is modeling through physical parameter, or whatever you call it, constitutive relationship, this is something which is a complex process, not dependent on initial fracture characterization, which, as far as I understand, Mark, doesn't enter your input, right? So you don't take nature fracture characteristics in your model to define this constitutive relationship. Right. So I would just separate them. But Wayne, please, you're next.
Yeah, thanks everybody for a really rewarding conversation. Alexei, quick question. Can we talk an EGS question here, or do you want to save that for later?
I think
yes, because I would ask it at the end, but if you can ask it here, please go ahead.
Thank you. So Ahmad mentioned that he felt there was some data from the Fervo experience that supported a more complex interpretation. And I wonder if that could be the next topic of conversation.
Well, I have seen some limited data in terms of MEQ again, and the growth direction seems to me to suggest that it's dominated by rock fabric / natural fracture systems, and so there might be other locations where they did the stimulation and they did not see that. I'm not aware of that, but the one that I have seen seems to suggest that. And surely the Utah Forge and others can address this better. John McLennan for sure. It's at least unexpected that is, some of the features that one sees do not correspond to single planar hydraulic fracturing, at least for a number of the stages.
Yeah, and I mean, my quick elevator pitch on geothermal is, I think we need to avoid jumping to conclusions, and I think it's really important to view our interpretations as hypotheses to be tested by data. When I started my PhD, I did a big lit review on EGS modeling, and the propagation of newly forming fractures was in only a very small percentage of any of the EGS models that were made from 1980s to the 2010s. I wrote a paper with Roland 10 years ago where we looked at all the historic EGS projects. All of them went above SH-min when they injected. Many of them don't have any evidence of unpropped fractures conductivity, and there's a lot of other things. So, I think the Forge project is going to be phenomenal. They've collected a ton of data. They're all crunching the numbers right now. But I mean, I'll just point out a few things at the Forge data set. They did 3 unpropped stages last year, and then they did a circulation test. they tried to do the circulation test and they had to inject above SH-min because the injectivity of the well was so low. So there's not a lot of shear stimulation happening there. They actually, at the beginning of their open hole section, they brought the bottom hole pressure close to SH-min and they held it for an hour. There was 0 microseismicity. So observations like that are not really supportive of the idea that this is a formation that's like just going off on shear stimulation. So my point is and there certainly are data sets where that did happen in geothermal. And I agree with Ahmad, like if you look at the forged fiber, I think it's pretty clear there is actually a fault or fracture zone affecting the fracture propagation at forge. So, natural fractures more often in geothermal are taking a role. And I think that's because the granitic rock is more likely to have big conductive fault zones or fracture zones running through it. But you can't take that as a given. And I think too often we kind of jump to the conclusion that the DFN is the right thing. And maybe it's not, maybe it is, but I think we need to be really careful about differentiating our hypothesis from our conclusions.
But the issue of pressure requirements for shear stimulation being high, that to me is not really an important issue, because the conventional approach would assume that these fractures are in a critical state. So if you bring it close to SH-min, bring the pressure close to SH-min, they would slip. But there's no guarantee that that's the case. So in fact, it might be that you need, there's cohesion. These are heel fractures that you need higher pressure. There are near wellbore pressure losses. You need higher pressure to activate fractures at the distance. So that to me is not the critical issue. The critical issue is when we design a stimulation job, can we rely on reactivation of natural fractures while pumping, even for a classical hydraulic fracture system? And to me, the answer is yes. That is, you can rely on that. But does it mean that you have to go and stimulate in an open interval, 500 feet long to get shear stimulation? Not necessarily. So these are kind of design details that I think we can debate, but to suggest that the shear stimulation by itself has not been successful. I think there's Soultz, there's Fenton Hill, there's Rosemann's, and to some extent even Forge, that support that there is shear stimulation. The question is, at what pressures, at rates, do you get shear stimulation?
Yeah, I mean, there's 50 years of EGS tests, and none of them have been commercially viable, except maybe a couple projects in France where they injected into giant faults. And I think if you inject into a giant fault, you can shear stimulate it. I mean, Forge is such a good example. They did 3 unpropped stages, and they got very little stimulation. The circulation rate between the propped and unpropped stimulations is about a 50x difference, even though when they circulated in the unpropped stimulations, they went above the minimum principal stress for their injection. And when they did the circulation in the propped stimulations, they were below SH-min. So they cheated on the unpropped circulations, and they still got a tiny production rate. I think it's just a great experiment. There are other cases, like at Desert Peak, they injected slightly below SH-min. They didn't stimulate for weeks, and then they slowly got a little bit that was probably thermal. In the second half of the EGS Collab project, they repeated this experiment. They actually ran image logs. They identified these intervals that had the most shear stimulatable fractures, and they packed them off and they brought it just below SH-min. Coulomb analysis said they should slip. They didn't slip. So I'm not saying that never happens. I'm just saying it might not happen.
Right, that's correct.
And we can't assume it's going to happen.
You're underscoring the low pressure that was used, not that shear was not possible, right? So my point is that to get shear, you may have to go to higher. In fact, you may have to do hydraulic fracturing to get shear.
So then how could you ever falsify the hypothesis, right? So in science, we have to have an observation that would prove it doesn't happen. Well, the only way to make shear stimulation happen is to do another thing that causes stimulation that isn't shear stimulation. That's a little fishy to me.
No. What you can do is assess your stress state and say, okay, and the natural fracture properties, and say to reactivate these, we need this much pressure at this distance. And to get
I've got a point here that I need to just jump in and mention this. First of all, we are looking at a very artificially simplified situation. First point is that as you create these hydraulic fractures, especially in horizontal wells, creation of the hydraulic fracture increases the minimum principal stress, changes the stress orientation. Therefore, the fractures, as you continue to create them, are not going to be parallel with each other. So the idea of showing a series of parallel hydraulic fractures is very good for modeling, but it doesn't fit the reality.
Yeah,
The
I'm
other
just-
thing
It
I would
does.
like to say is that I have looked at a lot of the pressure data when we when we fracture multiple horizontal wells. And the indication I get is that there is communication between the fractures, and this does not happen at the wellbore. It's not a wellbore effect, because sometimes it happens at different times during the fracturing process. So if we are going to do a realistic job of this, we need to look at the actual data from the field and see what is that data showing us, and then try to see how can we, by modeling, show the actual behavior of this. I just wanted to interject that point.
Well, I agree that turning is a complicated topic, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I
But I
agree, that could be a whole debate on that topic.
But I think now we have plenty of data showing parallel fractures, surprisingly parallel fractures, both at the core scale and at the well spacing scale.
Yeah.
Not only in a Wolfkamp.
Yeah.
And the data that I see does not support that.
Well, and it could just be two formations, and they have different properties, right?
Well, yeah, okay.
So, but the point you were making was on the pressure requirements for shear stimulation. That is what, is that concept relying on lower pressures than SH-min a valid concept? And what my point was that, the error may be in the fact that you're trying to activate things at pressures that are too low, that you need to increase your pressure to activate those. And this can be done by design.
Well, I mean, you could increase pressure by 2,500 PSI and nothing happens. And then you increase it by another 300 PSI and you go over SH-min and suddenly everything happens. That's an odd coincidence. The easier explanation is we opened up hydraulic fractures. But I guess the point I'll make on shear stimulation is, and this is what I found when I tried to model it, is I had to stack the deck to make it work. You have to make sure the fractures do not have cohesion. You have to make sure that when they slip, that they actually do retain long-term conductivity. You've got to make sure that they're all connected, because even if you reactivate a natural fracture, if it's not big enough, it doesn't go anywhere. It's got to be oriented. So you have to really set up everything just so to get it to work. And that bothered me when I started running models, because every time I tried to model shear stimulation, I kept hydraulic fracturing instead. And so that's why I just, from the modeling perspective, like a decade ago, came to the conclusion, or more than a decade ago, hey, this could happen, but it seems like it probably doesn't a lot of the time. And I think the field data suggests that. That's my view.
Can I jump in? So we have, can we just address two more questions from Romain and Julia?
Okay, sure.
If you don't mind, guys. Romain, please.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Great debate. I just wanted to add, echo some of the comments that were made before and add something else. I think that's on the importance of, yes, being driven by the data and the natural system. Obviously, in cases where there's a lot of natural fractures and the orientation is different from the principal stress direction, that's going to be different from the ones then when the natural fractures are aligned with the stresses. So, and I remember it's also dependent largely on the amount of differential stresses we have in the horizontal plane. And I remember we started to go on the complexity train on the modeling side in SLB with the UFM modeling at the time of the Barnett shale. And then it took a while to build all the simulators and everything. And later on, we realized, I think in the Barnett, it's highly fractured system, and I think it's quite different from the stress orientation. The complexity was different. And then when we moved to other fields, things got quite different. But another point I wanted to make is that lab data have shown and field data and modeling also have shown that usually the pumping rate and the viscosity effect, or the multiplied effect of pumping rate and viscosity effect, tend to override complexity when we push those fractures. And I think one thing we've realized when we were doing the modeling, is that you don't need a lot of differential stress to have the hydraulic fracture go through those natural fractures and kind of override the complexity. So I think I think that the modeling was quite useful on that perspective. That's a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, good comment. Yes.
Thank you, Romain.
Yeah.
Okay, Julia, you raise your hand. Please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Okay, well, this has been fantastic. And there's so many people on this call that know so much and have different experiences, different data sets. And so I want to just raise some points, and then I have a question at the end, which somebody asked in the chat. So the first one is, don't be dogmatic, like Mark said right at the very beginning, and that includes me. You know, I've published some papers where there were diagrams and concepts that I now think, yeah, that's probably not what's happening. But at the same time, I've gone backwards and forwards depending on what data sets I've looked at. I did bring up the thing, and Romain just mentioned it, which was the relative orientation of SH max and the natural fracture system, because in the Eagle Ford, everything is parallel. And I just did a core description in the Eagle Ford for HFTS 1 phase 3. And so, yeah, my experience in that, and in also the Wolfcamp cores that we looked at, was that there is clustering. So there is, you know, and when I'm talking about cores that are taken maybe 60 to 100 feet away from the stimulation. So I do see clustering. One thing, or people have been arguing about parallelism a lot. You know, if you look at my stereograms, a lot of the measured things that I interpreted as hydraulic fractures are subparallel, but there is a 45-degree spread actually. And so it's very interesting. Another point that I would like to make is that hydraulic fractures can be complex by themselves as they propagate through this heterogeneous medium that is the rock. And Roberto made a comment on that further down in the chat. And so Bethany Ryzak was a student I had, and we looked at a lot of reasons why that might be. So there's bifurcation that was mentioned. There's also a lot of twist tackling and changes in direction. Now, many of these are subtle, and so they may not, you know, create the kind of concept of these very large stimulated reservoir volumes that are, you know, or with a large distance orthogonal to SH max. That might not be the case. And so certainly, you know, with HFTS2, Gustavo Ugato published those diagrams with the fracture corridors. And I'm kind of going more towards that with complexity within the corridors. I don't really know, so don't be dogmatic. So my question, the last thing, is Reza asked in the chat, and I'm just going to scroll down and read it. When are we going to release the major assumption of modeling single fractures from each cluster? And I guess this is one of the important features. It's important to me because when I do a back of the envelope calculation, I count up the cluster, the clusters, the perforations that people say they did. And I count up the number of fractures that I see 100 feet away, and they don't match. Okay, there's way more fractures than and then I come back. Well, that's a big assumption. Do we only generate one fracture at the cluster? I don't know. And you know, Ali probably has a view on that as to the near wellbore nature of what you're doing when you generate a hydraulic fracture. So that's a question for the community, but specifically to both Mark and Ahmad, since they're the presenters today. And thanks, guys. Great job. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, and thanks for your comment. If I may go first. In fact, the idea of multiple fractures from the wellbore is, to me, a very valid concept. That is, you know, if you assume just one from the perf cluster, that's an oversimplification. And the initiation and propagation of multiple fractures, in fact, has been even documented well in the geothermal sector in the 1980s. And so they extend for about 20, 30 meters, and then, you know, as they extend and the pressure requirements change, they drop out. So there are multiple fractures that could potentially propagate both near wellbore, and I think perhaps branching and dividing again into multiple far away because of the excessive energy that is provided to them during the pumping.
And I basically agree with what you both just said. I think that's right. But I think it's a pointed question for me because that's what I'm doing in the model. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we're using things like first that fractal dimension thing. So we are mathematically treating the production and leak off as if it is a swarm of fractures, even if we don't visually represent that. Also, I think Ratterman had a very interesting speculation about this in their 2019 paper, where they said, we don't think that most of the fractures are propped. So they tried to make this differentiation between the productive fractures and they're more widely spaced. That's probably valid. And that would, again, kind of justify why we see, you know, the leak off looks like there's 10 times more fracture surface area than the production does. So that's my best guess at it. But overall, I'm very intimidated by a question by Julia because she knows whatever she says is true. And she also runs ultra marathons. So she knows she's really tough.
I do have one comment about propant,
Yeah.
and it is to do with the interpretation of what we saw in the cores. And I would say that I was kind of sucked into the idea that the main propant packs occurred where there was some fracture complexity. And that was what we observed for sure. But I think what we're missing is that many of those really planar features may or may not have had propant along them in the form of packs before we did the drilling. And certainly drilling itself flushed everything around. And so every fracture had propant in it, everyone, but it was all entrained in drilling mud. So when we looked at just the sand packs without any drilling mud, those were in those areas of complexity. But I worry about them being flushed out during drilling and or as the core is retrieved to the surface and everything degasses. And so, you know, fluidizes the muds and moves things around. So you know, I think that's a case of not taking what the observation at face value and remembering that's not maybe what it was like before we drilled the core. So I just throw that out there.
That's a good point.
Very valid. Yeah.
It looks like we're missing some diagnostics, right, to address this. So one is something like radiative tags in a drill through to see where you might have traces. But another thing, so we bring this strands of fractures, this subparallel system of fractures, assuming, well, at least some people assume, that they've been created in the process of fracturing, which means that they were driven by frac fluid. And I don't think it's a dress question because they don't have to be. And I don't think we ever collected data or analyzed what was the fluid in those strands of fractures, whether they were created adjacent to the principal fracture or they were driven by fluid injection from the well. In terms of modeling, that would be quite a different system. So, for example, the rate of the speed of fracture propagation would be very different whether you have just, you remember this discussion in parallel with dikes, that whether it's a single fracture where this subparallel fracturing happens as a side product and a prolastic effect, then you have a relatively fast single fracture propagation model versus where your precious frac fluid is split between these multiple branches, some small, some bigger, and then I would expect everything to go slower because we're spreading this energy in mass between multiple strands. So in terms of leak off, Mark, you can capture it. I think it's appropriate to what you do in ResRack, but in terms of understanding where our frac fluid goes, it's still an open question until we collect data, maybe put some traces, maybe analyze frac fluids. And Julie, maybe you know better, was any attempt of analyzing what fluid created those, if any, created those strands that we observed in cores?
No, I mean there were attempts to look at traces, but that wasn't the goal with individual fractures. They did try to use colored propant to see where the propant went, and it was a very ambitious idea. And on paper it looked great. In practice, it was terrible. Because the colors were very similar to natural sand grains anyway, and the colors changed with temperature and blah blah blah. And yeah, it was a whole litany of things. One thing that we did find was that there were many more grains at the very low size, so below the size that was ostensibly pumped. But when we got a sample of what was pumped and looked at it, we realized, oh yeah, they're not just sending grains of that size. It's a spectrum of sizes, and actually there's a lot of fines in there. And so what we found at least 100 feet out was that there was lots and lots of fines. In the packs, where we saw the packs, we saw a greater proportion of the larger pumped mesh size. So we kind of thought, well, fines transport easily, so maybe they get carried further. That's why we've got them where we are. That may not be really the reason why we're seeing what we see. So the short answer to your question is no, I don't think anything has been done, but I am definitely not the person who would know that. There's many people in companies who may have tried things that I'm not aware of. In terms of trying to really find out where the fluid went. Of course, there's modeling and experiments in the lab and whatnot that can try to depict how that works. But yeah, it's tough.
It is, yeah, especially in the lab with the scale.
I'll add a brief comment on the proppant. We produce for hundreds of feet above these shale wells, and we can see that in pressure measurements, if nothing else. But if I run a normal frac simulation in shale, the proppant goes up and then it all falls out and there's zero proppant above the well. But if we didn't need proppant to produce, then we wouldn't be pumping, a lot of proppant. So what we've gone to, and this is a constitutive model, is some of that proppant is getting held up and trapped as it flows through the fracture. That prevents it from all falling out. And I show the picture from your paper, Julia, like every time I introduce that concept, because I think that's what's happening. I think it's a patchy distribution of proppant it's getting hung up in places, and that is creating vertical proppant placement that actually helps us.
Okay, thank you. Well, one thing I can definitely conclude from this session, and big thanks to Mark and Ahmad for opening this mini series, and we're very lucky to have them to debate on this issue. It's 20 minutes past end of this meeting, and we still have more than 100 people around. So one lesson that John will need to discuss is that maybe we should extend debate sessions to 1 hour and a half. But it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for presenting your cases and staying late to answer additional questions. We'd like to continue with this mini series, so we're open to any feedback from the community on whether we should modify something, do something slightly different, change format. But I think it's been quite successful debut of these sessions. We'll try to, depending on topic, because there are not so many fantastic topics like this one. There are some, but we'll probably run out of options soon, where you can have clear case, clear topic with a very polarized view in the community that people could articulate and discuss. So that's somewhat limited. But let's aim maybe once a quarter. We could pick up something, then find people who represent different views, and then have a debate like this. So if there are any questions, so Diego dropped ARMA's email in chat area. Anyone, please volunteer topic. If you'd like to present particular side of the debate, communicate as well, so let us know. And then we'll set it up. So right now we don't have any plans for any future topic, but there are some ideas, but please, it's your feedback which is important to keep going.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks to the committee, and thanks, Mark, and appreciate the audience's interest and participation. It was a great experience.
Completely agree. Thanks a lot, Ahmad. It was fun. So thanks.
Thank you.